Good morning, Maloney class and Pines class. This recording is happening on Thursday, and Sunday morning, which is the time you will be seeing this, you will know whether or not we had a big storm along about right now this past Thursday. So John and I have he's got to get the dog walk sometime before the storm hits. And I'm seated right where I can see, watch it come, looking to the west. Actually, it's coming from the south, though. But anyhow, thank goodness for the rain that we've had. I've recorded 1.5 inches so far. And on what happens in this impending storm, we might even be back up to snuff. But enough of the weather report. Our lesson today comes at a time in the history as recorded in 2 Kings, about 30 years prior to the downfall of Jerusalem and the exile into Babylonia. I'd like to think about that as a defeat, like a 50-0 defeat of the warlord, the Yahweh of old. Sounds strange to start a Sunday school class that way. In fact, what I'm going to do is to change the focus of our lesson today, which is Huldah, the priestess, the prophetess, who brings the not so good news. Actually, she was courageous to King Josiah, letting him know that things are bad and they're not going to turn to any good. And I guess implying that it's punishment to the Judeans and that they would be defeated, as I say, 50-0. So what I would like to do is to change the focus from Huldah and her wisdom, as the lesson book says, to this watershed event in the life of the Israelites. Doubly so. It was a political watershed, or would in 30 so years. It's the end of all the kingdoms, or at least the kingships. That's it. Centuries of being led by some kings which were deemed to be good and others which are literally deemed to be bad, right there in 2 Kings. I'd call that the political watershed. But the more important, the one I'd like to concentrate on, is the theological watershed. Just think of the logic. As Moses was looking into the land of Canaan, and as the spies came back and said, well, they finally came back and said, okay, let's go. The Lord is going to give Jericho over to us. Think about the pomp and circumstance that as they marched around, as the Israelites marched around the walled city of Jericho and so forth and so on, there was the Ark of the Covenant. And this was a display of the Yahweh as seen by the Israelites as a God of war. Put your trust in this God and we will win. One way or the other, we will win. The watershed event is that so many of the battles have not turned out in favor of Yahweh, God that just sheer logic made them shift their position or vision of a wider vision of who God is, who Yahweh is, from that of being a warlord to the God of the universe. Sure, we have a covenant with this God, they say, but this God is God of everybody, of everything, every living thing, and that our failings, of the so-called failings of Yahweh, is really Yahweh taking command of our adversaries as a way of punishing us. That is the watershed, theological watershed I'd like to focus on, rather than Huldah and her message to the king of Judah at that time, that things are going to really be bad. Josiah, the boy king. And the thing that fascinated me about this watershed is who wrote what, who was writing this stuff down? Who wrote Kings, 2 Kings? And scholars have said that these people were called, will be called, the Deuteronomic historians, or Deuteronomic editors. This is sort of like the Renaissance and they did this during exile, sort of like the Enlightenment, where all of these stories from the past, the great acts of God, were recorded. And what fascinated me about this is the question, who were these people who wrote down the history? And the best we can come up with is to read the history and then read between the lines as to here these folks are writing the history of the kingdoms of Israel, both the northern and the southern, from the point of view of they know how things have come out. And so what things did they emphasize? And that's the only way I know how to come up with what these people thought, and is evidence to me of this shift or wider view, answering the question, who is God? What's he like? And the prophets are, of course, John Kirkendall last Sunday gave a definition of prophets, the great ones anyhow, and those that were written down during this period, those who spoke the word of God that actually was true and demonstratively true. And that's one of the concerns I have. We're not going to get into it in any depth today. John skated near it with the harem. What happened when Yahweh went to battle at Jericho, when the walls came tumbling down, was this horrific ending to it, where it was a scorched earth. Every living being was to be killed, slaughtered. Well, that's the Old Testament God that all of us, John called it well, is this bloody mess there in the book of Joshua. Well, that'll still be with us, even though we had a renaissance and a wider view of who God is. In fact, just look around in our own experience, war is hell. I think back to what Harry S. Truman, then President of the United States in 1945, think of the options he had. We had this atomic bomb, which could shorten the war, or we could not use it, and the war would be even worse. I'm sure that was what his thoughts were. Worse for both sides, a war of attrition. So, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Innocent women, children, men incinerated all in a flash. That war is hell. Or look at what's going on today in today's news. Yemen, the humanitarian crisis on the face of the earth. Patty stops looking at the evening news when the pictures are to come from the starving babies and so forth, right there within reach of the UN, not peacekeeping, but Red Cross-like aid. It's just unbelievable. So, okay, so we're not solving that problem and not likely to. But the good news is that the folks, just unbelievable tenacity of the Jewish people in face of defeats 50-0, they still trust and obey. I think that's, so what's the takeaway from today's lesson, unless I get to jabbering and it isn't clear what I think the takeaway is, and it's just that the God we worship does not change. We just, from experience, come to know better who God is. And that's the renaissance that I'd like to focus on as the takeaway from this lesson, which in a period of time of King Josiah, right before the defeat and off to Babylon, that attitude, which the Deuteronomic historians have written down and put in a place that can guide us and the people of Israel throughout the ages, and it's done that. Well, I found a passage in the Bible that I think is about a clear indication of the fingerprints of these Deuteronomic historians, fingerprints all over the description of this particular event. And I'd like to put it up as Exhibit A in my thesis that this is a renaissance, a theological renaissance during the exile. It comes from 2 Kings. If you're interested in actually reading it, I'll read parts of it. It's pretty long, but it's 2 Kings 18, verses 13 through 35, then 19, verses 1 through 20. This is all 2 Kings. And then finally, 19, verses 35 through 37. A synopsis. King Hezekiah, and he is listed as a good king by these Deuteronomic historians, as other kings are listed as bad kings. Our lesson writer, the lesson for today, starts out saying that's the book of Kings is about good kings and bad kings. Well, there are the fingerprints of the Deuteronomic writers. Well, Hezekiah is about, 30 some years ahead of Josiah. I'm not precise on that, but that gives a gauge about a generation ahead. And he faces the current bully on the block, the Assyrian. The Assyrian Empire is knocking on his door. We're going to run you over, says King Sennacherib. Give up, and we might even, you might find things much better on the other side if you just quit this depending on Yahweh. This God, Yahweh doesn't have a chance against the might of my armies. Well, Hezekiah, the good king, stays his ground, but he says, okay, well, let's see what I can do. This is in the face of lots of little towns in Judah have already been overrun by Assyria. And here is Sennacherib's army right outside his front door. So imagine the scene that's being described by these historians of the emissaries from King Sennacherib, or let's say the ambassadors, meeting those, their counterparts in Judah, namely Hezekiah's people, to negotiate. And I'll read some excerpts. That's where we are. And there's a lot of taunting going on that you can see, I claim, is just clear indications of the Deuteronomic historians. I'm reading from verse 20 in chapter 18. So call it the head ambassador for Sennacherib, who's now right at the gates, his army's right at the gates of Jerusalem. You think that mere words and counsel and strength for war, on whom do you now rely that you have rebelled against me? That is, you're resisting giving over to Sennacherib. Behold, you are now relying on Egypt. That's the other bully on the block in the south. Assyria is the bully on the block from the west. Behold, you are relying now on Egypt, that broken reed of a staff, which will pierce the hand of any man who leans on it, sharp stick. Such is the Pharaoh king of Egypt to all who rely on him. Doesn't work, in other words. But if you say to me, we rely on the Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, saying to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem? Come now, make a wager with my master, the king of Assyria. He's talking now, this is part of the negotiation. And he's telling the Judeans here, these negotiators, you don't have a chance. I will give you 2,000 horses if you are able on your part to set riders on them. In other words, you have no hope. How then can you repulse a single captain among the least of my master's servants when you rely on Egypt for chariots and for horsemen? Moreover, it is without the Lord that I have come up against this place to destroy it. The Lord said to me, go up to this land and destroy it. Now, this is part of, I think, if the Lord means Yahweh, and remember, this is the Assyrian talking. I think this is part of mocking the wider view of Yahweh, as Yahweh is using the Assyrians to punish Judah. Okay, then here comes the part that is almost, it's just negotiators who are smart and know how to get at public opinion. And so the Assyrian says, pray speak to your servants in Aramaic language. Oh, excuse me, the home team says, pray speak to your servants in the Aramaic language, for we understand it. But do not speak to us in the language of Judah within the hearing of the people who are on the wall. So the people are gathered around with this gathering. We got the army from Assyria, we got the people of Israel, and we got the emissaries from Hezekiah. So we understand your language, namely Aramaic, speaking to the Assyrians, the Judeans did that, but don't speak to us in our own language because our people will hear it and they'll see the dire circumstances. But then the Assyrian said to them, has my master sent me to speak words to your master and to you and not to the men sitting on the wall? They can hear it. He's speaking in Hebrew right now, who are doomed with you to eat their own, dung and drink their own urine. In other words, this is a 50-0 encounter. Then the Assyrian turned and faced the crowd on the wall and spoke to them in the language of Judah. Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you out of my hand. Do not let Hezekiah make you to rely on the Lord by saying the Lord will surely deliver us and this city and will not be given into the hand of the king of Syria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me and come out to me. Then every one of you will eat of his own vine, and every one of his own fig tree, and every one of you will drink the water of his own cistern, until I come and take you away to the land like your own land, a land of grain and wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olives and trees and honey. There you may live and not die. And guess what? This comes centuries after the 10 tribes of the north have done just that. They've been taken away to the land to the Assyrians and the Judeans and the Samaritans, namely the descendants of those who left the covenant and went to assimilate into Assyrian gods. That is the Samaritans were not. It was like the Hatfields and McCoys. All right. So what happens next? This is the time of Isaiah. So we go. Hezekiah goes to Isaiah and says, "Look, we need to work on this. What can we do?" And Isaiah says, "Things are going to." He says, "Behold, I will put a spirit in him, namely the Assyrian Sennacherib, so that he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will come to him, and I will cause him to fall by the sword of his own hand." So he's assuring Hezekiah, the good king, that his prayer is going to be answered. Now, the conclusion of this, this happens, and here's the conclusion, which is a return to the bloodiness that we mentioned earlier, that John mentioned last week. And that night the angel of the Lord went forth and slew 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men rose early in the morning, behold, there were all dead bodies. Then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went home and dwelt in Nineveh. And as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god, his son slew him with a sword and escaped into the land of Ararat. And that was it. So Isaiah's prediction came true. Okay, well, we're about to wrap this up. I have a story as a sidebar that I will share that gave me the interest in history that I hope we've done something with to see that the historians are actually writing from one period back and looking back to what happened, and you can see their fingerprints all over this. There is a temptation for the skeptic to say, yeah, these historians just made everything up. It's just a tall tale that none of this actually happened, and they're just ringing their own bell. Well, I have a counterexample for that claim. In mathematics, a counterexample is a devastating thing. If I think I have proved a theorem and somebody comes up with a counterexample, that's the worst kind of thing could possibly happen to a mathematician. A counterexample would be a existing mathematical construct such that all the hypotheses that I use to prove my theorem about all constructs fits, and yet the theorem does not apply, is false in the case of this one example, which shows that my argument is just flat wrong. So the counterexample to the person who's going to claim these historians sitting back at their desks during the exile, I just made these stories up, is false, because the discovery of a piece of writing, call it a scroll, with Sennacherib's hand on it, that is just parallel, almost word for word, for what the Deuteronomic historians have written in this account. So it is clear that these words almost were spoken, almost the same words, but the interpreter's Bible, is that the name of this thing? The Layman's Bible Commentary, that's my source for a lot of this, says there is the Sennacherib version of this is clear, and it just shows that this was not made up out of thin air. Excuse me. And the other sidebar, before I stop, has to do with sensitivity to the writer of history. That certainly writers of history are going to gather things together that they understand and they think are the most important. And that might be leaving some things out and emphasizing other things, which is certainly what the Deuteronomic historians have done. And that is when Patty and I first came back to Davidson on the faculty, just a year later, Rupert and Carol Barber came back. So Rupert and I started out early on, about the same time on the faculty. Well, Rupert was the drama department at the time at Davidson College. All right. Patty and I, during grad school and the year intervening between grad school and coming back to Davidson, met each lunchtime, and I have a confession to make, that what we did as we ate was we watched a soap opera, for crying out loud. We called it ATWT. Now, those of you at the Pines probably, and Carol certainly knows what that acronym stands for. As the World Turns. That was the soap opera. All right. What in the world does that have to do with looking at the Deuteronomic historians and their fingerprint on the writing of 2 Kings? Well, here it is. Rupert watched that as well, but and that was part of his profession, as the world turns. And he told us that he said, do you know that there's more than one author of As the World Turns? Well, we did. He says, well, I can tell when writer A is written one of the episodes versus writer B. Well, okay, that ends us on, at least we're not talking blood and guts and war as hell. So, well, storm has not hit yet here, and we can look back on Sunday and see what actually did come down out of the sky. Thanks for watching. Until next time, goodbye.